Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the hero's journey, and I'm going to keep it short and sweet because I had a long day, so I'm not going to be here for an hour like usual, but I will give it a minute to see if anybody's going to pop on live. Hey, Jen. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Last week on Winter is Writing, I had a special guest, Rosie Thor, and we talked about three-act structure, and we used two specific examples, the Hunger Games and Frozen. And it was really funny because at one point we started talking about Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, and both of us realized it had been so long since either of us had seen the film that we weren't able to discuss the structure off the top of our heads like we used to. And I know for me, when I first learned about writing structure, particularly the hero's journey, what I'm going to talk about today, Star Wars was a huge part of me learning structure. And I used to have the entire film basically memorized and could talk about it. But it had been so long since I'd seen it, I went and gave it a rewatch. And being the nerd that I am, I watched the despecialized version, so the original version from 1977. And then I went ahead and did a full three-act structure breakdown of it on my blog, and there's a link in the post to this live, so you can go check out that if you are interested. And today I was going to talk about Star Wars Episode 4 in relation to the hero's journey, which is a different way of thinking about structure than three-act structure. And first I'm going to give a little bit of context. So the hero's journey comes from the work of Joseph Campbell, who I'm just going to read off the Wikipedia blurb about him because it's really concise. He was an American professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College, and he worked in comparative mythology and comparative religion. And his work covers many aspects of the human experience, but his most well-known work is his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, from 1949, and in which he discussed his theory of the journey of the archetypal hero shared by world mythologies, and he calls it the monomyth. So for him, it was like a study of humanity and how disparate cultures across history have all generated a similar form of storytelling, which he distilled into the monomyth, which is the hero's journey. Now, personally, I have never read The Hero with a Thousand Faces, although it's on my list of things to do in life. Instead, I was introduced to the hero's journey by a student of Joseph Campbell's work. His name is Christopher Vogler, and he wrote this book called The Writer's Journey. And he basically translates Joseph Campbell's work into something usable by writers. And so here we go. This is helpful. Like Rosie wasn't able to do her diagram last week, and I know hers would have been more mountain-like. But here on this page, we have a little brief breakdown of three-act structure and the hero's journey overlaid over top of it. And over here, we've got the hero's journey itself, which is more cyclical. That's why it's in a circle. And I may or may not do a full blog post on Star Wars Episode 4 and the hero's journey, so you can have like two blog posts to compare and contrast. But I'm just going to list off the points here listed with the three-act structure that we talked about last week. So in Act 1, you start out with the ordinary world, which is kind of what we talked about as the setup last week, and then the call to adventure. And this is all in relation to the hero. It's called the hero's journey because it's really character focused and character driven, whereas three-act structure tends to feel more plot driven, even though good writers make it character driven. So anyways, so we have ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal of the call. I'll talk about these more in a bit. We have the mentor, the first threshold, and that's where you have the break into Act 2. And then you have tests, allies, enemies, which Rosie and I referred to as fun and games last week. So depending on the type of story that you're telling, the beginning of Act 2 can be like the promise of the premise, where you see all like the movie trailer moments and the stuff. It's like when Harry finally gets to Diagon Alley, that kind of stuff, in the first Harry Potter film. Or it's where things really start escalating and the hero is thrust into this new world that they have a lot of obstacles to overcome. So then things start getting really cryptic in the actual like labels for parts of the hero's journey. We've got approach to the inmost cave next, then the ordeal. It's quite the word, right? Ordeal. And those two are around the midpoint that Rosie and I talked about last week. And then there's the reward, or the seizing of the sword, and the road back. And these are the parts, like Rosie and I talked about the dark night of the soul, or all is lost, and how the main character basically hits a complete roadblock and they've lost everything and they have to learn something or choose to act differently to solve the problem and move forward. And that's kind of the same thing here with the reward and the road back. And then you have resurrection and return with the elixir. So the reason why the hero's journey is, God, can I counterclockwise while facing a camera? Ugh. This is taking so much coordination right now. Because since it's cyclical, the hero comes back to where they started, but having known more. So the clearest example of this is if you think of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the books. At the very end of Return of the King, Frodo returns to the Shire, and I believe that chapter is called The Scouring of the Shire. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you have a whole new experience in the ordinary world because the hero's returned, but because the hero has changed so much, there's a new relationship between them and that world. And in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo ends up ultimately leaving Middle-earth because of everything he's been through. So that's, I would almost, personally, I consider that like a more tragic ending for his character. But in a classic hero's journey, the hero returns triumphant with something to share with his ordinary world. So that's like a super brief rundown of the hero's journey. And I want to talk about it in relationship to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Particularly the beginning, because as I was reminded on my rewatch last weekend, Star Wars Episode 4 is broken down into what I would consider 4 clear acts. So Rosie and I talked about 3-act structure last week, and how Act 2 is usually twice the size of either Act 1 or Act 3. But because there's a midpoint in the middle, some people break Act 2 into 2 different acts. So you can have Acts 1 and 2 before the midpoint, and then you have Acts 3 and 4 after the midpoint to finish off the story. That's okay, don't worry about it, Matthias. See you later. In Star Wars, there are, Episode 4, there are 4 very clear acts. So Act 1 is basically all set up, the first half of which is setting up Princess Leia and her trying to get the plans to the Death Star to the Rebel Alliance, but she is waylaid and puts the plans with R2-D2, who's then on a mission to get to Obi-Wan Kenobi. And you see the droids then take an escape pod down to Tatooine. And then suddenly we're on Tatooine, and the droids are picked up by Jawas, and then the droids are sold to Luke Skywalker and Uncle Owen. Luke Skywalker is the protagonist of episodes 4, 5, and 6, and you don't meet him. I put timestamps in my blog post. You don't actually meet him until 16 minutes and 46 seconds into the film. And then the catalyst, now this is something you can argue different ways. So the catalyst in a story is something that happens often externally to the hero that forces them to act. And there are 3 stages to it in Star Wars, which actually makes it more appropriate to the hero's journey. So that's what I kind of want to focus on today, because what happens is R2-D2 runs away from the moisture farm, and Luke has to go and find him, but ends up also finding and meeting Obi-Wan Kenobi. And that's where R2 plays the full message of request for help from Princess Leia for Obi-Wan. And at that point in time, Obi-Wan gives Luke his father's lightsaber, huge moment, but also invites Luke to go with him to Alderaan to take the Death Star plans to the Rebel Alliance. Luke says no at that moment of time, because even though he hates being stuck on the moisture farm, that still seems too big of a life, too big of an adventure for him in the moment, and he says no. I put this whole moment as the catalyst in my blog post, but it can be argued differently, and that's why I prefer putting the hero's journey to it. So that's the refusal of the call, the 3rd step of the hero's journey, where Luke says no to Obi-Wan. But then what happens is usually there's something else that happens that forces the hero to make a different choice. And so when Luke finally returns to the farm, he sees that his aunt and uncle have been killed by stormtroopers, and he no longer has any ties to Tatooine, and it's a horrible, tragic experience. But he then realizes he wants to accept the call to adventure. That's what it's called, the call to adventure. So when I say refusal of the call or accept of the call, it's the call to adventure. And if his aunt and uncle hadn't died, he might not have gone with Obi-Wan at all. We'd have a completely different story. So it's a way of still being character driven, where the hero has resistance to becoming who they're meant to be, but an external circumstance forces them to make a decision unique to them, not unique to them, but different from what they would normally make. They're forced to enter the world of Act 2, which in Star Wars Episode 4 is actually Mos Eisley, where Obi-Wan takes Luke to find a ship to get them to Alderaan. And that's when you meet Han Solo and Chewbacca, and Han shoots first, obviously, and they don't actually get off of Tatooine until right before the midpoint of the film. The midpoint of the film is when the Death Star destroys Alderaan, and then the Millennium Falcon arrives in this rubble in space, like Alderaan is destroyed and in pieces around them, and they follow a ship and end up getting tractored into the Death Star. And when Obi-Wan Kenobi says that is no moon, that's the midpoint of the film. And now they're at the Death Star, and they have a whole new set of circumstances from which that they have to deal with. Originally, their goal was pretty simple: get to Alderaan, hand over the plans, right? But now Alderaan is gone, and they're stuck on the Death Star in the belly of the beast, and they have to escape. And they also find out that Princess Leia is being held on the Death Star, so of course they rescue her. And then it is the moment where Obi-Wan Kenobi sacrifices himself and basically allows Darth Vader to kill him in front of Luke. That is the break into Act 3 in Star Wars A New Hope. And so it's their moment of escape from the Death Star that is the break into Act 3, and is also the all is lost moment and the death of the mentor. Like, that's why that moment is so powerful, because so many things are happening at once. Obi-Wan died, Luke has lost his mentor, he's frozen in place. He's just firing randomly at the stormtroopers and at Darth Vader as the door's closing on him. And Luke doesn't move until Obi-Wan's Jedi ghostly Force voice says, "Run, Luke, run," and then Luke acts again. And then Act 3 is about gathering the troops and storming the castle, taking down the Death Star. But back to my original thing. So it's not just simple 3-act structure with Star Wars. It's really a hero's journey, and it's all about Luke's journey. And you can think about the series as a whole, and when I say series, I'm meaning the original 3 films, 4, 5, and 6, is in itself a larger version of the hero's journey. And you can think of episode 4 as an entire act 1 of a longer story. And Luke is being forced to act and being brought into a new version of himself. So like at the beginning of episode 4, he's just a kid on a moisture farm wanting to run away and become a fighter pilot with his friend, is it Wedge? I think that's his name. But by the end of the film, he's so much more than that. He's on his way to becoming a Jedi Knight, which is so different from what he set out to become. And it's that change that makes it all powerful. Now, what's fascinating to me, and I asked this in my blog post that I have linked, is the way they structured Act 1 of A New Hope. You're introduced to all of the conflict in the world first. You understand the Rebel Alliance, the Empire, Leia's predicament with the Death Star plans, and how all of her hope is in this little R2 unit to get to Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then you meet Luke and his boring home life. But there's all this conflict building up around him that he's not aware of until it reaches a head and his aunt and uncle are killed. And if you think about it, if those two things had been switched, if you had met Luke first and then gone up into space, it wouldn't have been as interesting, right? And another thing to think about, the opening crawl for Star Wars. First of all, interesting fact, it was the first film to not do opening credits, and it was a huge deal. But the opening crawl does such important work for the story, because by the time the opening crawl ends and you shifted down to see this Star Destroyer with the Rebel ship and the firefight, and then you're on the Rebel ship and there's more firefight, you already have context for what's going on. You understand that the Rebels are trying to protect the Death Star plans to get them back to their base. And if you didn't know that context, it would just be a firefight and you wouldn't care. And so this is one of the biggest things that as writers we need to learn how to do, is we need to give the audience or the reader enough context to understand the stakes so that they care. And this is where I have problems with like big disaster movies, because yes, on a human level, yes, they're humans, they're dying, but unless I get emotionally hooked into one or more characters and want them to survive or want them to succeed, I'm not going to have as much emotional resonance with the conflict that's going on. So that's kind of the biggest job as a writer, and I know I've touched on it before. It's setting up context and expectations and then fulfilling on them so that the audience A, cares, and B, is anxious to know what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, because they have in the back of their head how they want it to happen or the outcome that they're rooting for, but the real question is how you're going to get there. So if you think of big superhero films, like Captain Marvel was just released, great film, by the way. If you haven't seen it, stay all the way to the end of the credits, you won't be sorry. Is that, you know, at the end of the day, Captain Marvel's gonna win, right? Like, you go to a Marvel movie, you know you're not gonna get a tragedy, and I know Avengers Infinity War kind of flipped that expectation, but because I understand structure, I I know that most of what happened at the end of that film, in my opinion, is not going to stick. It's all going to change because I know it's a 2-film arc. So therefore, our cliffhanger was the midpoint of a longer story. And that just means change, not finality. So I have a prediction of what's going to happen, but I'm not going to tell anybody. Where was I? I was talking about expectations and fulfilling them. So the audience needs to care and have an expectation. And then as a writer, you have to meet them, but in a surprising and satisfying way. And that's where, if you go to a film, you know what's going to happen, and it happens in a way that you expect. It's not as satisfying as in if it happens in a much more interesting way that you don't expect, but is secretly more fulfilling than what your expectations were. It's really hard to deal with. And that's one of the things that as I go forward with Rose City Swing, I need to be really cognizant of, because people keep asking me, how are you going to top Swinging in the Rain? Kind of like how they asked me, how am I going to top the murder mystery before Swinging in the Rain happened? And the trick that I am keeping in mind is I'm going to still use my same set of tools, but I'm not going to try to recreate what I've already created. I'm purposely going to try to make something different. So that way I don't have to best myself. I'm just making something different, not necessarily better, if that makes sense. So anyways, that was a lot about the hero's journey. Again, I'd love it if you'd go check out the blog post I wrote on the 3-act structure of Star Wars A New Hope. Yeah, if there are any questions, I'll hang around for like 3 more minutes. Otherwise, yeah, just post a question in the comments if you're here and you're curious. Otherwise, I will just keep rambling for 3 minutes. So let's see, what can I talk about? I think I can talk about the mentor archetype. So in the hero's journey, you not only have the monomyth, which is the structure of the storytelling, you have a set of archetypal characters. And Obi-Wan Kenobi is obviously the mentor character. And in the hero's journey, the mentor character is very important to help the hero along in their journey so they kind of grow up. And it's very normal and it's almost cliche to kill off the mentor. And that's why that moment in these days can feel kind of hollow and cliche. It's because it's been done so much. And this is where we get to the difference between using structure as a crutch versus a trellis that you're growing your story organically on. You want to think of using the tools consciously. So like, why does Obi-Wan die? Obi-Wan dies because if he didn't, Luke would never grow up and become the Jedi he needs to become to save the day. And it's very simple, but nowadays you need to be more and more cognizant of your whys behind doing things as opposed to just doing them arbitrarily. Did I use the hero's journey for Swinging in the Rain? I did not. I used simple 3-act structure for Swinging in the Rain. And I'm not sure, I'll have to look at my source material for the plan for next year, which has been greenlit. I have an idea for the happiest event on Earth next year, and it has been greenlit by Bobak and Trudy, and so I get to run away and play with it now. But I'll have to see if it falls more under the hero's journey or 3-act structure. It'll probably be 3-act structure, but we'll find out. All right, and yes, a future show on establishing character is in the works. Rosie has agreed to do another show with me about character, and we'll probably talk about The Princess Bride, and we will suggest everyone watch it in advance of the show. So, because you can never see that film too many times. So yeah, we'll be talking about character. And let me check my calendar. I think it is Thursday the 11th at 6 p.m. is when Rosie and I will be doing that, but I'll obviously be here by myself in the meaning weeks. So yeah, that'll be a lot of fun because I really want to hear her take on Inigo Montoya being the hero of that story. I have a feeling we're going to get into a really intense conversation about that, and hopefully you all will enjoy it. So yeah, any last questions before I call it a night? No worries if you don't. I'm just curious. Oh, what do I think is going to happen to Luke in Star Wars 9? Well, so this is where we're getting into expectations for based on what is already established canon within the films. So, the Star Wars films have taught us that when a Jedi Master dies, they don't disappear. Like, we still saw Yoda in Episode 8. Yeah, there are spoilers on these shows. I hope all of you have seen it, or if you don't care, you don't care. So, Yoda was probably my favorite part of Episode 8. He was fabulous. So even though Luke is dead, he's not gone. As for his part in it, I haven't really thought too much of it. I'll probably have more to say if we ever get a teaser trailer, which the internet is up in arms about. It's really fun seeing Mark Hamill dodge the whole "where's our teaser trailer" question on Twitter. It's hilarious. If you're on Twitter and you're not following Mark Hamill, I suggest you remedy that immediately. Yeah, so he's not gone. And I have a feeling that his relationship with Rey will continue as Luke's relationship with Obi-Wan continued after Obi-Wan's death. And that's the kind of thing where that's expectations established by the canon, and if the next film didn't fulfill them, I think a lot of us would be angry about it. And that's a whole nother thing. Rosie and I could probably talk for hours on end about Episode 8 and how so many people were up in arms because it didn't meet their pre-existing expectations, and yet I'm over here going like, that was my favorite Star Wars movie I have seen in my entire life. So hey, I have another question. Do I have any other Star Wars thoughts? Ooh, Star Wars podcast, yes. One point I heard was how Rey is fulfilling the original promise of Luke, an actual nobody from the desert who will save the galaxy, rather than a destined son of Force reality. See, I really hope that they continue to fulfill that. And this is one of those things where it's iffy, because on the one hand, in Episode 7, they suggested that Rey's parentage was a mystery. And because of how we've been taught families work in the Star Wars universe, we're led to expect that family is important, and that the people in someone's family who we don't know who they are, even though we know there's a connection there, suggests importance. And in Episode 8, Kylo Ren suggested that Rey's parentage was like, it didn't matter. And it was interesting because they set up this expectation that, at least to Rey, her parents are a huge deal. And so that's the expectation that I hope they fulfill, that we at least get to answer that mystery, who her parents are or were, if they are gone or if they're still alive. But I agree that I like the idea that she's a nobody who is just epic. As someone who doesn't get to see many strong female characters, I like latch onto the ones that I find, and she is awesome and incredible. But the interesting thing, and this is going to be a controversial opinion that I may hang myself later for sharing on the internet, because of my study of the hero's journey, episodes 4, 5, and 6 are about Luke but they're also about Anakin and his return from the dark side, right? So that means episodes 1, 2, 3 are about his fall from the light to the dark. And I do have problems with episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. But I will say that as someone who understands the structure of the overarching story of episodes 1 through 6, having 4, 5, and 6 over here, and then 1 and 2, and then 3 just nested right in there, and it filled the structure hole in a really satisfying way to me. And my main problems were with Padme in episode 3. That was rough. But I thought Anakin's journey was satisfying in the way that I expected it to be, because I understood the overarching context in a way that I think people who don't study writing might not understand. Hi, Deborah. Good to see you. Even though I can't see you, I'm a little tired. So, hey. So I could totally talk about Star Wars some more, especially if a trailer drops. Maybe I could do a reaction video. That'd be hilarious. Maybe Rosie and I could do one together. That'd be even more funny. BB-8 is amazing. But yeah, episode 8 was phenomenal. I really need to rewatch it sometime soon. But I've got other things to study for Rose City Swing, the happiest event on Earth. Brad already knows kind of what his character is going to be, and he's very excited. So that's going to be incredible. So are there any last questions before I call it a night? Again, we have been talking about the hero's journey and Star Wars, because I love Star Wars. So good. All right. Let's end it with something super silly. If you had a lightsaber, what color would your lightsaber be? I haven't thought hard about this myself, but put it in the comments. What color would your lightsaber be? I'm leaning towards purple. I'm feeling the purple. All right, I might have put you all to sleep. So, aqua, yes. So yeah, I think I'm gonna call it a night. Sorry, I've been a little slow tonight. It's been a little bit of a rough week over here in my world, but so much pressure. It's okay. It's okay. You can change your mind. This isn't like your Harry Potter house, your Hogwarts house, where there's strong feelings. You can change your lightsaber color. But yeah. So I think I'm gonna call it a night. If you guys would be interested in me talking about Harry Potter too, I'm totally a Potter nut, so I'm happy to talk about Harry Potter as well. Just let me know. Again, I recommend checking out the blog post in the link if you're curious about my 3-act structure breakdown of A New Hope. I might do a hero's journey breakdown. We'll see how alive I am next week. But yeah, thank you for joining me. I hope you all have an amazing night. I'll probably be back on next Thursday around the same time with a new topic. And again, Rosie will be back on April 11th. So that's going to be awesome. I'm super excited. So have a good night, everyone. Bye.